moment of triumph. Look. It's gone! The picture is gone!
Can't get away from Spider-Man. No matter how hard I try, I think I'm just permanently associated with the character because I got my start, more or less, by reviewing all of his video games. Then I made the foolish mistake of sewing his costume together myself and taught an entire generation of teenage boys how to make clothes, a useful skill for the coming near apocalypse of '09. And then I explained why I thought Miles was better written in Spider-Verse than in the comics, and that got 1.4 million views. It's gotten so bad that when I opened commissions to make cosplay props for people, despite explicitly saying I won't do web shooters, I got nothing but requests for those. I was in talks with another YouTuber to do a collaboration, and he said, "Well, I don't really do Spider-Man videos on my channel, so I don't know what we can work on together," despite the dozens and dozens of videos I've made about other things. So I kinda swore it off for a while just to save myself some stress. Until I checked Patreon one day. And someone donated to the $100 tier for a video request. But not only did he give $100, he gave $500. Jonathan Stubbs is an insane madman with too much expendable income and a burning, passionate desire to hear me talk about these cartoons. Very few people have ever been that generous to little old me before, and I feel like I owe it to the guy to at least try, despite my newfound arachnophobia. Maybe it'll be fun to reminisce and talk about the old web slinger again. Perhaps looking at these shows with a new perspective and future context will reveal something interesting about them that hasn't been talked about yet. And maybe I'll finally collapse on my desk editing videos because I finally built up a tolerance to caffeine and my neural electroshock crown shorted out. If there's something you desperately want to hear me talk about, you can donate to the $100 tier on my Patreon to request a review just for you. But even a $1 donation helps me immensely. If just 3% of my subscribers donated only $1 a month, I wouldn't need a side job to make ends meet, and I could devote a lot more time to making videos and paying editors to help me get other ones out too. Please consider helping a brother out. Now on to tonight's main presentation. Being the overnight sensation that saved the Amazing Fantasy comic line and launched a new era for the Marvel Comics empire, Spider-Man quickly became a hot property in the early 1960s and hasn't lost that momentum since. With such a colorful and dynamic design, such broad and appealing stories, and such a unique characterization, people couldn't get enough of the webhead. And it only seemed logical to broaden his appeal outside of the comics with some of Marvel's first ever licensed merchandise, and eventually... So with that, let's take it back to the swinging 60s and talk about that goofy bullshit everyone's made a million memes over and doesn't take seriously. A show that's often looked past because of its reputation of just being cheesy garbage, with animation errors galore, absurdist logical paradoxes, and an ever-changing visual style that's so much fun to plaster with the impact font. However, it's actually kinda good. Well, okay, hear me out. Good is a relative term in this case.
Convince me!
As stated, this show's got a lot of problems. More problems than you can shake a web at. How the fuck? But there's a few episodes throughout it that are really solid for the time. I've often heard people miscredit the 90s animated show as the first superhero cartoon to adapt stories from the comics, but the show is riddled with really accurate recreations of classic Stan Lee and Steve Ditko stories, sometimes right down to the dialogue being used word for word. Granted, it's not always as pretty to look at as Steve's legendary penciling, but occasionally the show tries to get really accurate and just flat out traces his art into animation cells to bring it to life. I can't tell if that's cool or a little legally dubious, but the part that attracts me to this show's better episodes is that I feel like the people behind it, for better or for worse, understood Spider-Man as a character. He's a badass superhero that feels it's his personal responsibility to save the day, even though that heroism costs him in his personal and social life. Spider-Man is a genius, confident, wisecracking hero with the strength to rival most Avengers. But when he takes off the mask, he's a guy who can't catch a break and always feels like he's getting the short end of the stick. Somehow this series, against all odds, captures that essence in its own universe pretty well. Let's take the first episode, for example. It's a little weird that Peter is driving a car, but he gets into a bit of an accident on the outskirts of the city while on assignment for the Bugle. In trying to salvage his ride, he accidentally uncovers Doc Ock's secret lair where he's setting up a plan to create a man-made underground shockwave that will demolish New York with earthquakes. And his dialogue is pretty on point.
My plan is deceptively simple, just like you. Spider-Man, how did you get out of those handcuffs? Just talented, I guess. And to further cement our friendship.
Like, these are good quips, man. That's how Spider-Man talks. J. Jonah Jameson is pulled straight from the comics. Doc Ock feels like he was written by Stan Lee himself. Spider-Man's voice actor, the great Paul Soles, even makes his voice sound softer and weaker as Peter Parker, but manly and confident as Spider-Man.
I don't know what this is all about, but I'm gonna get some pictures for old J. Jonah Jameson. And there in the frozen wastelands, your friendly Spider-Man spots his, whatever it is.
You may be put off by the lighthearted and comical tone, but Spider-Man is an incredibly versatile character when it comes to tone. There are just as many silly stories for the character as there are dark and gritty ones, and yet both seem to work for him when handled properly by the right people. As it turns out, Lee, Ditko, and even John Romita Sr. all had a bit of a hand in the character design in this first season, and story consulting. I was really blown away by this first episode because I wasn't expecting this to be as competent as it is. But then reality sets in, and then you remember this has 22-minute episodes, and that the first daring adventure only lasted a prompt 10 minutes and 51 seconds. Then the second half plays as Spider-Man takes on the famed villain, Ice Aliens from Pluto. Okay, this is where I think the criticisms are mostly founded. This show has two types of episodes. Really cool adventures with comic villains and some pretty snappy writing, and really bizarre stuff where they tried to create their own villains for him to fight to save on the budget, often filled with really nonsensical stories and clunky animation.
Never count your chickens before they're hatched.
But even then, they get the basics right. Spidey's still a science whiz, he's still clever and smack talks the bad guys, and he still gets shafted as Peter Parker by his exploits. So I can't hate on it too much. I understand the necessity to create a new antagonist when you've got a weekly show and need to produce 52 episodes to play in syndication. By this point in history, Spidey was still only around for less than 5 years and didn't have this infinite well of characters and stories to pull from. But the demand for more of this runaway success of a character was huge. They only had a handful of source material to use, and it looks like they tried their best to pull as much from it as possible.
I wouldn't count on that, Mysterio.
I really like this effect for Mysterio's helmet, and I kind of want to see that done with like a newer setting and smoother animation. Unfortunately though, this show had a shoestring budget and couldn't afford to keep buying character rights as it went on, and season 2 and 3 are pretty devoid of new comic villains. That's probably what holds this show back from being beloved in an unironic sense. The extreme lack of budget.
These will make short work of you. You fool! If you destroy us all!
I can't get my hands on any concrete numbers, but it's kind of well known that, like, you know, just look at it. Now, let's not discount animation at the time and say this was, like, the best you could do. With the right money behind a project, you could get, like, Disney quality or the godlike Fleischer Superman cartoons with smooth, fluid movement and detailed character shading. That shit came out in 1941, and I think it looks better than most stuff being made now. 60s Spider-Man is unfortunately bogged down by the fact that the production company, Grand Trey Lawrence Animation, wanted to throw no money at it, meaning the end result looks like classic He-Man or that god-awful Star Trek cartoon. And you don't want to hear all these excuses and this positivity. You want to hear me complain and mock this thing, because outrage sells. Alright, it's bitching time. Spider-Man building complex structures out of webbing is stupid and makes zero sense, and there's a shocking amount of convenient construction equipment laying around for him to drive. How the fuck do you color his costume this wrong? There's so few drawings made for this show overall that they reuse animations constantly, which means animation errors are almost constant too, like his logo having the incorrect amount of legs, webs don't attach to anything like an unfortunate amount of video games. In fact, there are whole episodes that are reused animations. Characters are often stiff as hell. Spider-Man is off-model in pretty much every shot. What does that mean, you may ask? Typically, animated shows will have a character model sheet to draw their different poses from for consistency's sake. The lack of consistency in Peter Parker and Spidey makes me wonder if they even had a model sheet, because his eyes, logos, webs, and face change as frequently as the perspective cuts to a new angle. And don't even get me started on the sound mixing. What's that, Electro? I can't hear you. The music is really loud. What are you saying? I almost wonder what this show would feel like with more modern sound mixing. Let's test that.
Sandman. There's $1 million price tag on this Spider-Man.
Well, that was fucking weird. Yeah, this show definitely has its flaws, and I'd say a lot of its reputation is founded. But I feel like people don't often give it enough props for the episodes that it got right, because they're classic, unfettered Spider-Man.
I'll just have to prove Spider-Man's innocence another way. It couldn't happen to a nicer guy. I have to face this sooner or later. I'd better do it as Spider-Man. Yes, Uncle Ben is dead, and in a sense it's really I who killed him. Because I didn't realize in time that with great power there must also always be great responsibility. But I know it now. And so long as I live, Spider-Man will never shirk his duty again. Robbers, killers, beware. Spider-Man is here.
This show probably had the most accurate recreation of Amazing Fantasy 15 ever adapted to screen. So sure, while it has its quirks and fair share of weirdness, it's not entirely terrible, and if you ignore some of those weirder parts, I think it's actually worth a watch for fans of the character. Oh god, I have it. I want to take this retrospective a little slower, and instead of cramming 4 reviews into a single video, really give each show room to breathe. Plus, it takes a long time to watch an entire TV show front to back, so be patient. Tune in next time for the continuation, where Spidey can finally afford extra puff paint and he has a few above-average bros to tag along and help.